All right, good morning and welcome to Office Hours. And today our guest is Daniel Herriges, who is the senior editor at Strong Towns and someone that is a prolific writer on questions of housing and development and policy options related to this. And so I'm really excited to be able to tackle this question because it is at a really critical part, we are at a really critical part of the question of what can we do to address and solve housing shortages across the country. There's a lack of attainable housing. That is housing that can be attained by people at various income levels, people at various economic circumstances, as well as personal circumstances. And the question is not only how did we get here, but also how do we move forward? And so Daniel, why don't you take a moment to either introduce yourself briefly, as well as just give us an understanding of what it is that comes to mind as you think of unleashing the swarm of small-scale development.
Thanks, Norm. I see a bunch of familiar names here as I look around the gallery, but thanks to everybody who's logged in today. I don't know how much other introduction is needed. I think Norm did an excellent job, but yeah, I've kind of my beat at Strong Towns for the number of years I've been writing here has increasingly been housing issues, housing shortages, and the whole development ecosystem. I think the question of unleashing incremental development at a large scale, it's bigger than just the question of housing shortages. It's really, I'm increasingly convinced that it is the key to getting back to the kind of resilient, human-scaled, financially productive communities that we need to have. I don't think the Strong Towns mission succeeds in any sense without unleashing incremental development on an entirely different order of magnitude than we're used to today, but more akin to something that actually was the norm in historical cities. The phrase "unleash the swarm," I can't take any credit for that. It comes from Kevin Klinkenberg, who is a longtime friend of ours, brilliant planner, economic developer, urban designer in Kansas City. And he used the phrase, and I latched onto it because I love it, because what it conveys. It's not meant to sound menacing, unleash the swarm, depending on how you feel about, animals such as bees might be a little bit ominous. What are you trying to do to my community? I think about it in terms of pollinators, and I've written about it using that metaphor repeatedly, that, healthy ecosystems need pollinators. And a pollinator in this sense, in the sense of an economic ecosystem, it's someone who transmits the knowledge and the model of how to do something, and helps that spread and helps that germinate throughout our communities. And what we need is, we need to revive the whole ecosystem of not just people who are going to be actually coordinating and undertaking small-scale building projects, but the people who have the knowledge of how to build community, have the knowledge of how to build a built environment that works. The people who are adjacent to the actual ones doing the building. So, you have your developer, you have your general contractor, you have your plumber, your HVAC person, your electrician. You also need your bankers. You also need local planning officials who get it. You need, all these people adjacent. You need attorneys. You need a whole ecosystem of people who can support this endeavor. And it needs to be something where you can organically kind of plug into this. You can, I want to do a project in my neighborhood. I want to buy a small piece of land and I want to build a duplex. I want to build a corner store. I want to do this. I want to do that. The ability to come and plug in and have access to a network of people who have the knowledge and have the connections and have the resources. That's how it used to work. That's how, Chicago is my favorite example of this. When you visit Chicago today, you see miles upon miles upon miles of this just absolutely wonderful fine-grained development pattern, 2 flats, row homes, neighborhood scale businesses. And what's not immediately obvious until you think about it is, well, what kind of economic environment produced that? Chicago famously grew from a prairie village of 30,000 people in 1850 to a metropolis of 1 million people in 1890, to a metropolis of 3 million people by 1930. That's just an incredible rate of growth. There's no parallel to it today. And that happened because of this decentralized ecosystem of small scale builders doing a house at a time, a block at a time. No parallel in the US. Thank you, Andrew, in the comments, because that's very true. We've sort of extinguished this ecosystem of small scale development in the US and in different forms and to different extents in a lot of kind of wealthy economies. You still see this in the global South. There are places where you see this happen. I've even written about El Alto, Bolivia, on the outskirts of La Paz as an example of incremental development happening today in much the way that it would have happened in the US prior to the modern era of zoning and large-scale infrastructure in the suburban experiment. But I've really become an evangelist for this, not because what we're going to reproduce today is going to look like Chicago in 1850 when that was the frontier, there was all this land, and it's not that. But I think to the question of how do we address housing shortages, how do we address the scarcity of walkable urban places and places that we know are resilient and can pay for themselves and are going to work in the future. How do we address that at scale? I'm sorry, I'm getting over a cold. I do have a bit of a lingering cough. There is a reflex among a lot of people involved in these issues from a policy perspective to say, we need massive scale. We need to enlist the largest developers to do giant master plan projects, or we need to enlist the might and the resources of the federal government. We need a national social housing program. We need 12 billion units. I think the answer is more counterintuitive than that. I am an evangelist for unleashing a swarm of incremental developers, 10, 100, 500 times as many as are out doing this work today. Not because it doesn't scale, because it's the only thing that scales. Because the existing development... Did someone unmute there? Oh. Yeah, it is the only thing that scales. There is too much ossification in sort of the institutions that support development today, the big companies, the big financing, the big projects, the scale, the speed at which our bureaucratic mechanisms work, which is slow and methodical and painstaking. There are limits to scaling that up. We are not going to get large scale developers that do most of the building in our urban centers today to double or triple their output per year. There are no feasible conditions in the near future under which that would happen. We need to unlock a totally different set of players and resources from the sidelines. People who own a home, own some land, want to do something productive with it. House their neighbors, house their families, generate an income stream, start a business. People who don't think of themselves as capital D developers as their profession, but actually could, with the right connections and the right ambition, could coordinate a small scale building project in their own neighborhood. We need to unlock a totally different model, and one that harkens back to what used to be the predominant way that we built our cities in this country.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that touches on what you've touched on, a bunch of the different elements of the first question that I was going to ask. So I'm going to reframe it just a little bit to ask it in this way. What are the regulatory practices that currently exist that are standing in the way? If we think of what needs to be cleared out, but also then what needs to be created. You touched on a little bit of like mobilizing a new team of developers that aren't the standard players, but are the ones that traditionally we see we're always active, the homeowner that works on a weekend and things like that. How do we get that? So what do we need to clear away and what do we need to create?
I think what we need to clear away, some of that is fairly straightforward. If you think about ultimately what is real estate development, what is developing a piece of property? It is, you make some physical improvements, you build something on the land, and you make it worth more than it was when you started. And ultimately, you have costs associated with this project. You're probably going to take on debt to do it. You got to pay off those costs by selling it when you're done or by renting it out and having an income stream from that when you're done. But in some way, it's got to generate the money to pay off the costs associated with the project. And the costs associated with development range from the actual construction materials and construction labor to a whole bunch of soft costs, things like having an architect, having an engineer for certain things, having, legal costs, and then the costs associated with getting through regulation. What we've done through modern land use regulation that is pervasive in cities and suburbs, in small towns, pretty much everywhere, is we've taken a bunch of the costs associated with development and we've imposed costs that don't scale with the size of the project, but that fall most heavily on small projects. So one simple example is parking. Most cities in North America have parking requirements. If you were going to buy up a whole city block and you're going to build a big apartment complex, you can design a way pretty easily to meet the parking requirement of 1 space per unit, 1.5, 2, whatever it is. A single family home, we figured out how to do this at scale. If you want to build a fourplex on a standard urban lot, and a very typical code would require you to provide 6 off-street parking spaces. 1.5 per unit is pretty common for that fourplex. I mean, you've all seen a standard urban lot. Where are you going to put 6 parking spaces without dramatically compromising this building or just making it physically impossible? There are a lot of costs associated with regulatory compliance that just don't scale. There are, parking is one. Honestly, costs just involving getting through the bureaucratic process, paying the application fees, holding the land while you wait for delay in the process. There are cities where it can take years, literally not even months, but years from applying for a building permit or a zoning change to actually breaking ground on a project. And during that whole time, you have to control the land and you have to pay the taxes on it. You have to have insurance. You have all these carrying costs. You have the cost of capital. There are a whole bunch of things that come from a regulatory process that is really streamlined for large projects with large increments of capital, but that make it really, really prohibitive to do small projects. There are building code expectations in a lot of cases that are scaled to large projects. That when you try to do something at a small scale, like that fixed expense just becomes an untenable proportion of the overall project cost. Our land use codes, kind of from top to bottom, are almost designed around the presumption of a deep-pocketed developer with access to a lot of finance that can have some patience. So that's the biggest thing that's standing in the way, I think. Regulatory requirements that aren't flexible for the needs of, how do you make something small and incremental actually work? We've learned in cities that have started to relax these regulatory requirements, including parking mandates, that simply getting the regulatory obstacle out of the way does not unleash a flood of small-scale development. Because we haven't had that flood for decades, and we don't have the ecosystem of people who know how to do it. In a lot of cases, you have to have a whole lot of hustle to be a small developer right now. When you read the profiles we publish on Strong Towns of people who do this work, they're kind of hero profiles. Like, look at this amazingly dedicated, brilliant, resourceful, charismatic person doing this work. That shouldn't be who you have to be. The missing middle housing that populates neighborhoods built before around the 1930s, 1940s in America's cities wasn't built by ridiculously dedicated, capable, charismatic, like heroic people, nor was it built by deep-pocketed, highly professional real estate developers. The triple-deckers all over New England, a lot of them were built by factory owners, mill owners who wanted housing for their workforce. They were built by carpenters who, on the weekends did their own project. People got together with their cousins and, let's put up a house, and you could do this. And even if you removed some of the regulatory barriers to doing that today, you still don't have this critical mass of people with the know-how and the connections. So increasingly, I've started to focus on understanding what does it look like to rebuild that. And we can talk more. I think we'll get into talking more about South Bend, Indiana, and some of the places that are really trailblazing on that front.
Yeah, certainly. I love that. And your thoughts were reminding me of the podcast that Chuck did with Seth Zarin on creating a culture of building and almost reclaiming it or finding it back amidst the historical rubble to try to find a way in order to understand like what was it that was so remarkable about unremarkable people being able to construct housing at will, and to be able to do so in ways that really served didn't always serve everyone, but served many interests very well. So the next question then, would you recommend a maximum lot width in small towns to discourage large-scale full block development? The idea around fine-grained urbanism. I like the phrase that a planning firm used around here when they were talking about what they were going to do for our local village. They said, no assembly required. The trouble is that phrase and that idea didn't make it into the final report, much to my chagrin. And I think it touches on this question when the stakes are increased because the scale gets magnified. What can be done? Is this actually a good tool, or is that something that you would be cautious about as in terms of regulatory compliance?
I think it would be a little context dependent. I'm not fully sold philosophically on maximum this, maximum that, trying to use the heavy hand of regulation to totally engineer the development pattern we want. It almost feels like an overcorrection, but I think there are places where it would be a warranted overcorrection. It's worth understanding in terms of lot sizes. Norm, you mentioned the term assembly. It has been conventional wisdom in economic development offices for a long time now that economic development looks like a big developer with a big project, and they're going to need a big site to do that big project. And you can find, this is something else that Kevin Klinkenberg has written about really compellingly. You can find all sorts of examples in government documents, policy documents, where planners will say, one challenge or one obstacle to economic development in our town is we don't have enough assemblable land. We don't have enough large sites that would interest a large developer. And Kevin's, exhortation there was savor your small parcels and create more of them. I do think as a general rule, I absolutely think that cities just about everywhere in an almost unqualified way need to be looking at getting rid of minimum lot sizes. Other than contexts where there is a genuine health and safety issue, which we can address as such, there's simply no reason not to allow very, very small increments of development on very, very small pieces of land. And that is the pattern that worked through all over the world throughout thousands of years of history. We can see that you can end up with a really bustling, a really productive, a wonderful city that way. The reality is that you're going to have big developers, especially in a place where there's demand, there's a booming market, there's population growth. You're going to have big developers in the game. They're not going to go away. And in terms of solving housing problems, you need your big developers too. You need your big apartment buildings in a major city. I am not on board with the strain of strong towns thinking that says we should demonize the big building, the tall building, the big project. But we need to level the playing field a little. I would say the version of this that I would certainly support is, I think, maybe not an absolute maximum lot width. There are cases where you need a big building, where you need a large lot to accommodate something that is going to be worthwhile and productive for your community. I think that big projects, though, deserve a lot more scrutiny. What I would do is radically reform land use codes and the development approval process to allow most small scale incremental things that build on the existing fabric of a place to be done as of right. Go in, get your permit, start building. And I would not have big block scale projects be as of right. Maybe you have something like a maximum block perimeter, as Andrew just suggested in the chat here, maximum lot width. There is a particular value in width because width affects in some unique ways how a building interfaces with the public realm. How a very wide lot, that a whole city block or something, if you screw up the streetscape, you're screwing up the experience of walking around that neighborhood for a whole lot of people. If you have a width of 25 feet and you screw up the streetscape, well, people are past that in a few paces and on to the next building. But like in Sarasota, where I recently moved from, there's all this like block size Texas donut, apartment projects going up adjacent to downtown. And you can see very clearly like which ones got the streetscape right and which one's like, okay, now we got a big blank wall and there's no awning, there's no shade for the pedestrian. Well, now it's like we are locked into this block is going to be a miserable place to walk, and it's going to be a miserable place to walk for the next 40 years for the life of this building. So large projects the stakes are much higher in terms of what they do to the public realm. They deserve more scrutiny in terms of what they do to the public realm. So I think it's absolutely fine to have the default be, you can do small things as of right. You can do small things with minimum hurdle. If you want to do big things, apply for your variance. Come to us for permission. Make the case that this meets all the city's codes, meets the standards in the comp plan, whatever. Right now, the standard is almost everything. You need a variance, you need special permission, you need to go through a whole set of regulatory hurdles. And the big developers are the ones who have the high-priced lawyer and have the patience to wait that process out. And so they're the only ones in the game. I'm fine with the guys who can hire the big shot land use attorney having to hire the big shot land use attorney and get their special permission to do their big project. But we need to clear those obstacles for small incremental projects.
Yeah, and certainly one of those big obstacles is the challenge of parking. And so Randy from Bristol, Wisconsin, he's the city manager there, and he asked, how do you solve parking complaints of no spaces or not enough spaces, particularly with more small lot developments, or if there's going to be a second or third or fourth unit added to a property, or in the city of Vancouver, for example, where it's now up to 6 homes on a site on a parcel of land that was previously designated as single family homes. There's always a pushback. There's some suggestion even that you need to wait until your transit system is ready before you begin to make changes. Where do you land on those types of things? And what can we bring to our municipalities in terms of guidance for them?
I have never been to a place that actually has a parking problem. I just haven't. Like, I've been to places where it's difficult to park, where it's tedious to park. The problem isn't the availability of parking, that it's insufficient. The problem is isn't the government needs to step in to guarantee parking. The problem is usually something else. The problem is that government needs to, in some way, facilitate a reasonable market in parking, and the feedback loops, the price signals that are actually going to make it available where it needs to be and the amount it needs to be. So to get less abstract about this question, it's raised as a boogeyman a lot. Like, well, we can't allow as of right fourplexes in this neighborhood of single family homes because there isn't going to be enough parking. In my experience, that's never really true. And every time that boogeyman is raised, like, there is on-street parking. There is the potential, larger projects are going to have parking because the tenants are going to want parking. They're not going to have none just because the code says it's not mandatory, because developers are still responding to market signals. I don't want to respond to a hypothetical problem just by assuming that the worst case hypothetical is real, because my experience is that it isn't. But let's treat it in good faith. Let's treat the objection in good faith and not assume it's a NIMBY smokescreen. Often what you have is that either the potential for on-street parking isn't perceived as something that residents of new, multifamily housing could use, either because there isn't a culture of parking on the street. I've seen that, especially in places in suburbia, places in the Sun Belt, where there's actually sort of this expectation that you legally can park on the street. I've encountered this in Sarasota, in Florida. You can legally parallel park on the street, and the people who live on that street think you can't, and they get mad at you for parking in front of their house. And it's like, I don't see a no parking sign. But the cultural expectation is, well, everyone has a driveway and you park in your driveway. And so cities can step in and just say no, actually there's on-street parking, and we're going to sign it as on-street parking, and we're going to communicate that drivers can use this. And yeah, it's going to narrow the driving lane, and that's a feature, not a bug. It's going to slow down traffic in a residential area. If you narrow the driving lane, that's great. That's not a problem. Cities can also think about where you've got the right of way to allow on-street parking, but it's not allowed, you can allow it. Where you've got too much demand for the existing on-street parking in an area, it's probably because you're underpricing it. That's the classic Donald Shoup insight that where the market clearing price of parking is greater than zero, but the government set price of street parking is zero, you're going to have queuing. You're going to have people circling the block looking for a space. When I lived in San Francisco, I didn't own a car, but whenever I rented one to, take a trip to the mountains or something, I would have to circle my neighborhood for at least 20 minutes to find a place to park my rented car. That's a government failure. But the government failure isn't we didn't require people to provide enough off-street parking. The government failure was we didn't manage the market in parking in the right of way that the city already owns. We didn't charge people the right price for it. People will pay to park in a neighborhood that's desirable enough that there are a lot of people who want to live there and there are a lot of people who want to be there. That means parking there is worthwhile. I wrote a piece a couple years ago, Norm, you might find the link to it, called "There are Problems the Market Can't Solve. Parking Isn't One of Them." If we want to take this example to its extreme, at a certain point, let's say you have a neighborhood where, there really is a lot of population density, a lot of commercial density. There isn't much off-street parking, so the on-street parking fills up. And the price of that on-street parking is getting pretty high, and it's starting to cause some friction for people wanting to be in this place. You know what's going to happen? It's going to become profitable to buy land and put parking on it. When you go to downtown Minneapolis, there are buildings that are just parking garages, and you pay to park in them. And a lot of those garages, a lot of the people paying to park in them are the tenants of nearby apartment buildings that don't have their own garage. I had an assignment when I was in planning school, and we had to be pretend apartment hunters in order to get tours of some of these buildings. It was for a private sector development course. And they would tell us as part of the sales pitch, we don't have parking on site. There's a garage on the corner. It's separately owned, but we have a deal with them. You get a special rate. You can buy a parking pass for a month. That's what most of our residents do. The market will solve this. If there's a place people want to be and they want to park their cars there, there is a market clearing price for that, and someone will provide it. It just won't be free. Okay, I'm fine with that. So I don't think that this is a real problem. I think it's a market failure imposed by, a public policy failure.
Certainly touches on aspects of the way in which creating stasis, freezing places, creates a whole host of other expectations that parking will always be available because it was when I first got here. Homes will always look the way that they did because that's how it was when I first got here. Even that, there will be no commercial or retail sort of structures around me because there wasn't when I first got here. But in the traditional development pattern, you would say, well, that would be expected. You would have clusters of homes. Retail would be a little bit closer towards the town core, but over time, gradually, you would begin to see those things pop up in those new places. And so there's somewhat of I feel like in our community, there's this balance where residents will rightly say, things haven't had to change. Why do we have to change them now? And you might not like the prices. You may not like that you're frozen out of this neighborhood, but I'm fine. And it's not purely self-interest, but I think that there's kind of just this sense, why do we have to change things? Things are quite good. And that becomes a real difficulty. And I think it touches on what Elliot has asked in terms of a question, how to get cities to incubate stronger streetscapes in downtown cores, as well as for more suburban zones. And maybe within the context of, as it relates to housing, particularly the way that I think a lot of new housing development is still missing something of what it takes to be places for people rather than just sterile sort of boxes where people live, or one of the promises of the suburban development pattern being that we can design away neighborhood conflict by having every door face the street rather than and every garage door isolate everyone. And the consequences, there's still neighborhood conflict, but we've actually had a degraded form of housing development patterns. What do you think in terms of how do we incubate stronger streetscapes?
Incubate is an interesting word there, and it's one I'm kind of mulling over in real time as I think about this question. Chuck writes about this more eloquently than I do, but the urban design principles that lead to strong streetscapes are actually really, really simple. And we have a tendency to overthink them. Architects in particular have a tendency to overthink them because they get into all these questions about the aesthetics of a building that maybe don't matter at the end of the day. There are a few really basic principles. You have human scale, not in terms of the overall size of the building, but in terms of sort of the approachability. Like as you're walking down the street, the building shouldn't feel, monolithic and imposing, and you shouldn't have like a single long blank wall. Buildings need, like the sidewalk level details of the building need to sort of be at a scale that engages the pedestrian. So that means things like, yeah, you got your front door facing the street, engaging with the street in some way, saying like, welcome, this is a home. Having a build to line, Chuck talks about this, as opposed to having setbacks, which are standard in suburban style zoning codes. You want a strong streetscape. One of the best things you can do is have a build to line so that the fronts of all the buildings actually create a street wall and create a sense of enclosure. Most of the kind of, commercial neighborhood main streets already have this, in that they have zero setbacks and buildings come right up to the sidewalk. It doesn't even have to be zero, but you want, that's a pretty basic regulation that you can have. Just flip the script, and instead of having a mandatory setback, you have to be at least this far from the street. Have come up to this line, this is where you got to be. The back of the building, do whatever you want. You can see examples of this, especially, going back to that question of, looking outside of North America. You look at the global South, you can see really, really good urbanism that consists of the absolute most basic concrete box buildings you could possibly make. But they have active fronts, they got doors, they got windows, they got a build to line right to the street, and they're engaging the street. The ingredients are really, really simple. So I think actually a much simpler land use code than just about any city has today could deal with those ingredients effectively. So some of it is code, but some of it is also having a building culture, having a template. Again, I go back to sort of kind of the golden age in some ways of American urban design, that period from about 1890 to 1930, where you had the brownstones of New York, the Victorians of San Francisco, the triple deckers of New England all going up. You have a unified aesthetic. You have really, really pleasing streetscapes. These neighborhoods are considered historic and charming and incredibly desirable today. There weren't really detailed design review standards that went into that. What there was a building culture. There was a simple template for, this is what a house in this place looks like. It was a local building culture. They were using local materials, and it was being transmitted as a vernacular. This is just what you do. And so part of the whole Unleash the Swarm concept is when you have a critical mass of small scale developers who are learning from each other, you're going to arrive at a new local vernacular. And the repetition and the harmony in seeing that replicated over and over and over again, part of that is what creates the idea of a pleasing streetscape. And we've lost that, and now we're trying to fumble our way back to it. And instead, what we have right now is this really incoherent, we have incoherent urbanism because we don't have a critical mass of developers using any sort of vernacular approach. We have occasionally, architects doing a bespoke home here on this lot or that lot. We have big projects that are built usually according to some sort of a spreadsheet architecture model. They've been value engineered to sort of optimize for the financing that exists and optimize for the codes that exist. But the idea of vernacular, that's something you hear a lot when you talk to the new urbanists, and that's a big part of the puzzle here, and it's part of what's been lost.
Mm-hmm. I think that leads right into the next question, which is in its own way an interesting vernacular question of the catalog home and the practice in the past of entire kits being put together, packaged and sent by rail to various places from Sears and other places. And I guess the question is around the fact that we're starting to see some interest in returning to this, I think as a way of sidestepping some of the regulatory hassles and challenges that a lot of builders face, as well as just trying to recreate the expectation that we can lower the bar to entry and actually see a lot of new housing emerge. What is stopping local planning offices from publishing pre-approved catalogs of homes? And take that question where you want it. It's not just what is stopping them. There's sometimes just staff shortages or whatever that looks like. But what is behind it? What do you think is inspirational about it? And do you have any reasons for concern or reasons why you would pause?
I love this idea and I want to see it spread much more widely. South Bend, Indiana is, I sort of foreshadowed that I wanted to talk about South Bend. I always want to talk about South Bend because they're doing a whole bunch of amazing stuff there. One interesting initiative that came out of their planning department just this past year is a catalog of pre-approved home designs for infill in South Bend's neighborhoods on single lots. And it ranges from a few different templates for a single family home up to, you can do a duplex, you can do a fourplex, you can do a small scale commercial building, I believe. And you basically get to bypass a lot of the development approval process if you use one of these templates. And you can modify it in certain ways, and you can modify some of the superficial aesthetics of it. But it's like, we're going to let you, it's like in the old Super Mario games when you went down the pipe and you like instantly jumped from world 4 to world 7 or something. We're going to let you jump ahead in the process and bypass a bunch of the hurdles if you go through this. You don't have to go through this, but you can. I think it's great. I think it is an attempt to proactively sow the seeds of a vernacular design tradition. These models they're really based on home types that are already pervasive in South Bend, mostly dating to the early 20th century, and saying, you can do something that looks like this because we know that something that looks like this is going to look good in this place because there are a bunch of them already. They worked with small developers, they worked with architects to really get these designs right. So I think a lot of cities could do this. In terms of the question, what is stopping them? Staff shortages, capacity, sure. But the biggest thing that's stopping planning departments from doing this is a mental block or a set of assumptions where they don't see it as their purview. The planning profession in North America grew initially out of landscape architecture. A lot of the early leading lights in the profession were landscape architects. You had people like Frederick Law Olmsted, you had Daniel Burnham. And so initially the idea of urban planning was much more like, we are concerned with the physical planning of the community. We're going to lay out, what are our public spaces? What are our grand boulevards? What are our civic, key destinations? And then a grid of streets around that where you can build according to a recurring kind of vernacular pattern. But we're going to create the overall skeleton for a harmonious, well-functioning city. That used to be what urban planning was. What urban planning has turned into for a lot of reasons. And some of it was the hubris of some of those kind of big thinking, let's create the city beautiful master planners and the backlash against that. Certainly there was the mid-century backlash against urban renewal and really, really arrogant top-down schemes to, reinvent whole neighborhoods, to condemn and demolish and rebuild. The backlash led to the profession as a whole really retreating from the notion that its purview was to get the urban design of the community right, to really play SimCity and to really design places. And instead, I think nowadays what planners are trained to do and what almost all planning departments think of themselves as is our job is to regulate private development at the margins. Our job maybe to facilitate, to make sure that infrastructure is adequate for private development, things like that. But essentially, like, we're not designing the city. That's not our role. We are going to regulate it. We are going to oversee it. And so a lot of planning directors, if you suggested to them, you guys at City Hall should publish a catalog of pre-approved home designs, I think their reaction would be more befuddlement than anything. Like, why would we do that? That's not our job. Because there's been this whole philosophical sea change in what planning is. You see places like South Bend that are pushing back against this in a way that I think is helpful. And I don't know, the backlash against sort of that early version of what urban planning was not without merit and was not without its reasons. So I think what we can recognize is that what planning departments are doing right now isn't working in a whole lot of ways. And we need to really get back to first principles in a lot of ways and not just tweak the codes at the margins, the parking minimums or the minimum lot sizes or the setbacks or what have you. But rethink, like, what are we trying to do here?
Planning efforts in an underinvested minority community area. And there's a lot of distrust. There's prior patterns of displacement that have occurred within these neighborhoods, as well as other places where they were driven. Many people were displaced from, settled in their community, and then now are concerned that that may happen again, even in the form of small scale development. So what can Strong Towns local conversations groups do to help communities like this embrace becoming small scale developers themselves? He said that there's work on parking, on allowing fourplexes, funding smaller developer education, kind of like South Bend. What are some of the things that can help in terms of those that are leery around displacement, especially mega project displacement, but confronting maybe the opportunity here to do something in terms of small scale development?
This is such an important question, and I'm glad it was asked. One of the things that's inspiring to me about the South Bend story is who's making it happen. There are about 100 small scale developers working in South Bend today who are like sort of to some extent or another plugged into this ecosystem I've talked about. Going to the monthly meetups, learning from the people who've kind of been trained there by the Incremental Development Alliance and other groups. Of that 100, a huge number are women, a huge number are people of color. Most of them grew up in or have longstanding ties to the low-income, formerly redlined areas of sort of the west side of South Bend. They're working overwhelmingly in those neighborhoods. This whole incremental development model is not something that pertains to the really hot markets with sky-high land values, the places that the big Wall Street-backed developers are interested in. This is something that has its most potential in or disinvested areas. That means you do have this question of mistrust and who is this for and who's going to benefit from it. That question is very, very real and should never be dismissed. Like the distrust of developers that you see in communities of color, in communities that have been redlined, that have been systematically disinvested in, like that mistrust is very, very well earned. And for reasons that aren't just historical, but are going on today. The developer is understood as an outsider to the community because that's almost always what their experience of development is. It's someone who comes in who isn't rooted in the community, doesn't have longstanding ties there, doesn't have skin in the game. It's an investor who's going to come in from outside and is going to build something responsive to their own idea of what would be profitable or what they want to build or what the demand is. And not necessarily responsive to what people on the ground who have lived in that place for a long time are saying. And ultimately the profits are going to leave the community. That's been the norm for a long, long, long time. So it's either we're not going to have any development and things are going to continue to kind of stagnate or decay here, and that's not good. But when we have development, it's not going to be for us. That wariness is so, so true. I think the answer is you need to grow this alternative model and let people see that you can be the ones to build up your own neighborhood. I'm so excited that at our national gathering in Charlotte later this spring, that our keynote speaker is Majora Carter, who is a community activist and a developer from the Bronx, who her kind of mantra is, you don't have to leave your neighborhood to live in a better one. You can be the ones to do this. That is, it's so important, and focusing on incremental and focusing on what is the next stage that can be done by the people in a place with the resources they already have. Like, that's the key to making this possible. We have to have some guardrails so these communities don't just get overrun by cataclysmic money. I've had a bunch of good conversations about this with the president of a neighborhood association in a neighborhood of Sarasota that's very much like this. It's called Park East. It's mostly small scale missing middle housing, a lot of duplexes, a couple kind of cottage courts, mostly inhabited by low income people of color, Black and Latino. And this guy, he's lived in the neighborhood for years. He's a small scale property owner and landlord and small scale developer. He's part of the community. He's trusted in the community. I could come in as Mr. Strong Towns and say, incremental development, missing middle housing, it's going to help you guys. And I wouldn't have any credibility there. I would be seen as, lecturing to people and who the heck are you? He can talk to that community and people are going to hear him because they're his neighbors. It's got to come from within. The message has to come from within. What's worked in South Bend was getting people to the table early. The people who kind of spearheaded the push for incremental development in South Bend, Mike Keene, who's a former college professor, and some other people we've talked about, when they started setting up meetups to, workshops to learn about small scale development, to learn the ropes, to get some training, they made a point of reaching out to community organizations, to entrepreneurship programs at local colleges that focused on historically disadvantaged minorities, to all sorts of groups that would just get people in the room. And they said, put your name on our event as a sponsor and share it with your lists. We won't charge you anything. We want to get the word out. And we want to make this something where the people in the room learning how to do this are representative of South Bend. What Mike says is, small scale development should be something where you don't have to be invited to the right Christmas party on the 20th story of an office building to get connected to the people who are going to help you do this. But they were really intentionally inclusive. They said, like, if I do this, if I set up a series of workshops on small scale development and most of the people in the room look like me, a middle-aged white guy, college professor, then I'm doing it wrong. They needed to get the people in the room, and then those people become the people who are going to do the outreach to the community, who are going to do projects, build something, and then all their neighbors see, like, here's a Black woman who grew up in this neighborhood and has been here for 30 years, and she's, she created a bunch of space for small businesses, for her own tax accounting business. She's talking about affordable housing. She's walking the talk. And she's not a developer from outside. And, like, we can do this, but it has to grow from inside. And I think that there's room for people who are kind of evangelists for this stuff to plant the seeds and to work to be intentionally inclusive and create access to this knowledge and these resources and these networks. But you can't go in and lecture because it's not going to be received. We need to show people that the people who live in a neighborhood can be the ones to build that neighborhood.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And I think we've got time to squeeze in one more question that came up in the chat, which is around the question of informal settlements. You actually wrote about this in terms of a video game that you had played, and the things that you saw in terms of the way that informal settlements were being presented. But do you want to talk about, like, what is it that we are missing in terms of not allowing informal development, or not allowing, I mean, on the one hand, we don't want fire traps and things like that, but is there any element of that where there's even a step before this small scale development, which is sort of the informal development, sort of the informal adaptation? Certainly there is more that happens than meets the eye. Urban 3 has done a lot of analysis in North Carolina that shows actually most of the informal development is happening on very wealthy properties. And it's structures that are not sanctioned, not permitted, and they're, I think, coming back with $700 million in unreported property improvements. Now, that is something that is, properly before the courts and things like that. But the other side of it is a lot of very modest changes aren't happening, and I think it's putting people at risk. We have a lot of RV encampments and things like that, as well as tent cities. How do we get any closing thoughts on a small scale swarm of informal settlements? What does that look like?
I am fascinated by favelas and informal development in, global South countries. Not as a model for anything that is going to or should happen in North America, but as a lesson in, some of the economics of how a place does evolve organically in an environment of kind of do whatever you want. I mean, let's be clear, like favelas, the pueblos jóvenes, the new towns outside of, like, Lima, Peru, you see these things happen in places where there are weak government institutions. There's no effective means of enforcing land title. Like, you have shanty towns on the outskirts of these cities because people just go and squat there and no one is kicking them off the land. That is never going to happen in North America. We wouldn't want it to happen in our cities. That the model isn't like, let's do this. However, you can go to favelas outside of Rio, you can go to places like this where 30 years ago it was a shanty town, and now the people living there have land title. They have more permanent structures. They have electricity. They have running water. They have built second and third stories on their homes. They, all sorts of, infrastructure has been formalized. You can go to Medellin, Colombia, and you can find these neighborhoods that sprawled up the hill really informally, really, illegally. And now they've got, the public sector has come in and put in escalators to help people commute on foot in these neighborhoods. There are favelas in Rio that have McDonald's now. These are informal settlements that have become proper cities. There's one outside of Lima, via El Salvador, that has a metro stop. It started as a literal shanty town. And that's no different from how Chicago grew, or Cincinnati, or St. Louis. We used to do that here. We don't do that anymore. We're not going to do that. But informal development happens all the time in modern North America, in the US and Canada. Our friend Nolan Gray, who's written a fantastic book on zoning, and he's a repeat Strong Towns contributor. Nolan Gray points out that the vast majority of the affordable housing created in Queens in the 1990s was illegally subdivided basement apartments, something like 48,000 of them over the course of that decade. That's informal development. That's an ADU. It's just that ADUs weren't legal and these people weren't getting permits to do it. They were just doing it. But that was most of the new affordable housing stock in gentrifying New York City. People do it out of necessity all the time. I think what we need to do is we need to look at how can we have reasonable health and safety standards, have some sort of a social compact about this is the minimum standard to which we are going to tolerate people having to live in our society. And we can have that conversation, but also recognize that that minimum standard needs to be something that people can actually do. If you set the floor for what is acceptable housing too high, then everyone under that floor, what's their option? Hack something illegally, or, live in an overcrowded situation with relatives or roommates, or be homeless. And we have exploding homelessness crises. We have tent encampments in a lot of America's major cities. That is a response to the fact that we have said, here's the floor for what a housing unit can be. And if you can't afford that floor, you're SOL. So we do need to reconsider some of these things. And I don't think it's by saying that there shouldn't be a floor, that there shouldn't be basic health and safety standards, that we need favelas in North America. But I think what that looks like is you should be able to do the basement apartment, carve that out. You should be able to do the ADU. Not only that, but we should work on what are the obstacles that people in poor communities can't do this. Why, how do we make it so you can get the financing to do the ADU behind your house in a low-income neighborhood in Atlanta that you inherited from generations of your family that you could never have afforded to buy? But you're low income and you're sitting in this place, and can you create an income stream for yourself, or create low cost housing for a relative? Or this is what people used to do. This is what people still do, but they're doing it under the table, and they're finding ways to hack it that are really suboptimal, that are maybe unsafe. Let's start to formalize some of that. SROs are a big topic of discussion in a lot of major cities. Single room occupancy, essentially dormitory housing for adults. And there are people who are really kind of, pearl clutching about it. Is this what it's come to? Housing's so expensive and we're just going to throw up our hands and say, we can't bring the cost down. So now you don't get the dignity of your own apartment. You have to live in a glorified dorm. Well, people are already doing this. And isn't renting a large apartment and sharing it with roommates functionally an SRO? Isn't renting a single family home with 4 or 5 bedrooms and sharing it with a bunch of roommates you're not related to? That's functionally an SRO. People do that all over the place. It exists in our communities, but a lot of the housing production that we need is going to be informal, in the sense that right now we don't have a clear legal path to do it. let's create that path because people are going to do it anyway. And let's make so the options that are available to people without the means to live the way we think everyone should live have a like decent, humane, comfortable option.
Well, you've done it again. I thought, oh no, I've given you such a tough, like, new topic to cover right as we come to the close of the hour, and yet you gave a great answer. Really appreciate a lot of great insight there. Again, we're going to share the links that are available in the chat as well when they get posted to YouTube. So that way, if you're watching this afterwards, you'll be able to track down some of the resources that are mentioned here. But thank you again, Daniel. It's been great to have you as a repeat participant in office hours. Thank you so much. And you're welcome to stick around for all of the folks that are on the chat for our after party. It's not so much a party, just a discussion of strong towns, which is the closest thing to the perfect party that I can imagine. But that's what's on deck. Just to highlight too, coming up next week will be a discussion with John Reuter on how to serve well. I phrased it, I got appointed to a committee, now what? And that's the whole idea. We field lots of different questions from people asking, hey, how do I serve well? What are some of the tactics that I can use? What are the ways that I can be of great service in my community? Someone asked me because I was a young mother to support a general plan committee, or someone asked me because I'm a senior, someone asked because of whatever it is that you bring to the table. And so we want to definitely dive into that and think through those questions in a helpful way. So if you have questions related to that question, certainly email them to me, or certainly consider, I want to make this available and make it open. So that way, if you have friends or other people that are currently serving, definitely let them know that we're going to be chatting about this. If they want, it'll be a 1 hour thing. And if I know anything about John Reuter, it's that he's very thorough, very quick, and brings tons of great insights and advice. And so that's something I'm going to be